When a country that in recent years has dealt with the convoy protests, university encampment protests, we could be in for another summer of discontent with calls for nationwide encampment protests across the country related to, once again, the situation in the Middle East. So how do protesters need to deal with this? How do police need to deal with this? There's an interesting new publication from the Canadian Constitution Foundation letting both protesters and police better understand the rights and responsibilities around these kinds of protests. It's called Know Your Rights, a guide to protest in Canada, more at theccf.ca. Josh Dehaas is a counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation and is on the line with us here. Josh, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Rob.
Let's talk about why there's a need for this. First of all, what were you hoping in terms of filling a void with this publication?
Well, the last several years, we've seen tons of protests across Canada about all kinds of issues from vaccine passports, vaccine mandates, all the way to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And a lot of what protesters are doing is perfectly legal and protected by the constitutional rights to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly. But a lot of what they're doing is not legal, and it's not protected. And, protesters and police alike don't seem to know where the line is between what's legal and what's not legal. So we thought there was a role for us to step in and explain, here are your rights. Here's what you can do. Here's where you can protest. Here's how you can protest. And here's where you go over the line and step into criminal activity.
Are those lines clear enough, do you think?
So the lines, they could be clearer in some cases for sure. And the reason for that is when you look at your rights, they're outlined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and they're really short. They say you have the right to freedom of expression, you have the right to peaceful assembly, and then there are demonstrably justified limits in a free and democratic society. And courts don't deal with these issues very often. There often aren't arrests made, and courts are not usually asked to delineate, what the word peaceful and peaceful assembly means. So we stepped in and we looked at all of the court decisions that do get into this stuff and decided, okay, there are some clear lines here. There are some things we can advise the public. We can tell police about where the limits are. And so we hope that we can add to some of that clarity.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the big things, and it was kind of the common thread when we had the convoy protests or the encampment protests, is the idea of protesters basically not leaving. Like, it's one thing, a protest, a rally at the legislature, whatever, in an afternoon, but the idea that a protest would sort of have no end, at what point does that cross a line?
So that's really the biggest question. And so what you have to do is look at the word peaceful. And what does peaceful mean here? So peaceful doesn't mean just that you're not acting violently. It means that you're not substantially interfering with the rights of other people, whether it's the right to, also use that public space, that park, or whether it's the right to drive down the street and not be blockaded by other people using their cars, or, standing in the middle of the street trying to coerce you or force you to agree with their message. So if you look at the legal decisions, there's actually more than a dozen decisions that look at blockades, for example. And while we all know that you can use the streets to protest, you can legally march, that's protected activity. Once you start, standing there or blocking people with your cars or your bodies, or even occupying a public space with tents and staying there, overnight, for example, it starts to become reasonable for the government to limit those activities. And, you could be facing charges if you do blockading. You could face trespassing charges if you engage in encampments. Those things are not a legally protected activity under the Charter.
Yeah, because I think if we look at, the law pertaining to mischief specifically, or even trespassing, like if we really applied it to the, strict letter of the law, I mean, almost any rally or protest might kind of get caught up in this. But I guess we do allow, and maybe the Charter does allow, for some leeway when it comes to peaceful expression of some kind of protest or rally.
Well, I think that there is a pretty clear line, and the line is where you start to coerce other people. So it's one thing to use the public space for protest, whether you're talking about a street march or an encampment. It's another thing once you start coercing other people to not use that space, once you interfere with their right to also use it. And so, that, for example, with an encampment, that probably happens once you start staying overnight. And so you've seen cases where municipalities have said, this is a park, this is a place where people have a right to protest, but we're going to put in a time, place, and manner restriction saying you can't camp here overnight. And courts have tended to uphold those, right? So we know that the line in that case is probably don't stay overnight. And with the street march, I think that that's a really tough one, because where does the street march become a blockade? I think it becomes a blockade as soon as you start stopping and preventing traffic from moving, more than just sort of fleetingly, because then you're saying this space belongs to me now, and other people who want to use it, too bad, you can't also use that space. So the moving protest, I think that's almost always going to be protected. The sitting down and blockading and stopping traffic for hours or days on end, I don't think that's going to be protected.
And on the police side of things, the law enforcement side, I mean, we don't want police overreacting. We want to make sure that the right to peaceful assembly, the right to protest is protected. But I think maybe we've seen where police underreact, or we see different kinds of reactions to different protests where, that creates uncertainty, or maybe it even creates double standards. How problematic might that be?
Well, police have a really, really tough job here, and that is the risk, right? Like they know that they have the Constitution to uphold, and that means facilitating peaceful protests, but they're not well educated necessarily on where these lines are, and that can lead them to underreact, and they allow encampments to become entrenched because they don't want to deal with the risk that someone will accuse them of breaching their charter rights, or they allow repeated blockades in Toronto here, for example. They've been happening fairly regularly in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So police are in a tough place, but we have seen in some cases where sort of the squeaky wheel gets the grease type thing, where certain causes seem to get away with illegal activity like blockading or intimidation, and then other causes police just let it go because there's fewer complaints about those, and that can't be right. In a rule of law country, the law has to apply equally. I may hate one protester's message and love another, but the police need to be treating both groups equally, and we're not always seeing that in Canada. We're often seeing police going easy on one group and hard on another, and that just can't be acceptable.
No, absolutely. And then there's the question of the law itself, right? Police don't make the laws, lawmakers do. And the law can and does change. And we're seeing right now where already some municipalities have brought in laws that sort of specify where protests can and can't happen. It sounds like federally, even this idea of bubble zones, that's under consideration. So what's your position on that, first of all?
Well, bubble zones are a really, really bad and unconstitutional response to what is often a real problem. There's been a lot of, criminal intimidation, mischief, hateful speech, excessive noise, all of these things that you can legally regulate going on at certain protests. Again, related in Toronto here, for example, to the Israel-Gaza conflict. And all of those things are, things where there are existing laws in place, whether it's criminal intimidation, mischief, even excessive noise bylaws that are perfectly constitutional, but not being enforced. And so because they haven't been enforced, you have a lot of really unacceptable behavior associated with these protests. And the response of city councils has been, well, let's just ban the protests. Well, that's not acceptable. The whole point of protest and of freedom of expression is that you should be able to express unpopular ideas, because that's how you convince your fellow Canadians that actually, the government has this wrong, and there's a better way to look at this particular issue. So bubble zones are the wrong way to go. They are essentially content-based protest bans, when what government should be doing instead is just enforcing the law against those actual criminal activities that are not protected.
So when it comes to sensitive places, I guess if that's the right word, like schools or places of worship, and I know that's kind of been part of the justification for these laws, how then do we sort of protect that if it's necessary? Does that mean trespassing, or does that mean, as you say, other laws that already exist?
Yeah, so I think that what you see with these bubble zones is people say, well, it started with abortion clinics. These are sensitive places. Women are in a vulnerable state when they go here. They shouldn't have to deal with protests. Then it spread to, hospitals and during COVID, while, nurses and doctors and patients, they shouldn't have to deal with protests. Then it became schools. Now it's places of worship. If you look at the bubble zone laws that are being put in place in my part of the country in Toronto, they cover so much land potentially that you wouldn't be able to march or protest anywhere. And often there are very legitimate reasons to protest outside of a school, a hospital, a church. Think of a residential school survivor who wants to protest outside of a Catholic church. She should be able to do that in a free country. So the solution really needs to be better enforcement of actual criminal activity that doesn't have to do with the speech, but has to do with the way that it's being expressed, or that's happening at the same time, like that criminal intimidation where you're, blocking somebody from getting into a synagogue or a mosque. Police can and should arrest people for that. Or if you're blasting noise at 100 decibels outside of a hospital and you're disturbing the people inside, there's nothing wrong with city bylaw officers coming in, ticketing that person, making that noise stop. So focus on the physical consequences or the form of the speech, but don't start, banning speech outside of all of these places, because that's really a content-based restriction, and it's really censorship at the end of the day.
Yeah, which speaks, I guess, too, to the role of the courts in all of this. I mean, these laws are being challenged in court. Certainly, we saw some really consequential court decisions with regard to the use of the Emergencies Act, which was deployed against the protests in Ottawa. So how important are the courts in responding to these situations and helping us all better understand these lines?
Yeah, the courts have a really, really important job here, and that is to, to settle these disputes and explain to people what is covered by your right to peaceful protest and what is not peaceful and not acceptable in a free country. And so, that's what the CCF does. We raise money, and we, for example, right now we're raising money to challenge municipal censorship, including things like these bubble zones, because they can tell us where the line is. And when people know where the line is, whether it's the protesters or the police, we're all going to be able to go out there and get our message across and protest and try to convince our fellow citizens about who's right in any controversial debate. But when we don't know, what we end up with is chaos, and that can often lead to violence, because people turn to self-help. They want to go and take that blockader out of the street and physically move them out of the way if police aren't going to do it for them. So people need to figure out what these rules are, and courts are slowly but surely defining those for us.
Absolutely. Well, it's called Know Your Rights, a guide to protesting Canada. It's up at theccf.ca, as well as further background on some of these related important issues. Josh, thank you so much for your insight on this, and appreciate making some time for us here.
Thanks so much, Rob.